just a few other little highlights on the geologic timescale, mostly looking at Washington and some of the highlights of living organisms that we've studied. Birds. We looked at birds a lot over the course of this quarter. They really just started to appear about 200 million years ago. They kind of share ancestry with dinosaurs. Zooming forward quite a bit, the Rocky Mountains, 65 million years ago, these giant mountains that we have now, the Rocky Mountains, just were starting to form. And about that same time, these little small mammals also started to diversify. So a lot of the mammals we've been talking about didn't even exist back when the Rockies were starting to form. About 30 million years ago, Washington started forming even more land, and modern birds and mammals appear. So that's about the same sort of time frame that a lot of land started appearing for our state. Then we were actually in the world somewhere developing some of the species that we've been studying, and they just didn't exist before that. Hard to appreciate sometimes how much of a changing place the world is. Back to those coal forests, these are extinct plants. It's hard you see sometimes an artist's depiction of what it must have looked like back then, but we really have very little idea other than from the fossils that are left over. In terms of our history, we've kind of interspersed some of human history in through this class. We only appeared 2 million years ago, if that, in terms of modern humans, and so we're a real newcomer on the scene. Other animals have been around a lot longer than we have. We're just kind of still getting used to this big mud ball. Within the last million years now, getting closer, although nothing in terms of the human lifespan, but within the last million years, then some of the major peaks in Washington started to form. A lot of the soils were laid down by volcanic ash. The Yakima River started to form a channel. And then in more recent times, well within human history now, 20,000 years ago, over the course of several time frames, there was these major floods, those Missoula floods, that covered most of the eastern half of the state. And so if you were sitting where you probably are right now, you would be under maybe 100 feet of water. And so that looks pretty different, especially when you look out at this dry, deserty environment right now. Hard to picture that you would have been sitting at the bottom of a lake, or hopefully floating on top of it in a boat. People probably arrived, and this is hotly debated, so I won't wade into it too much, somewhere around 14,000 years ago in North America, during one of those ice ages, crossed the ice bridge from Asia into North America. And we're probably here to witness some of those floods. But that's kind of how long humans have been present in North America in general, and probably somewhat in Washington State. So there's a bit of an overview of how all this happened, or at least when it happened. And now I want to get into the how. So why did it take so long for mammals to get here? How did they appear? Where did they come from? Why are birds an offshoot of dinosaurs? So I want to tackle a few of those questions as we look at some slides to demonstrate some of those. Species don't have to change. In fact, many species stay the same for long, long periods of time. But when the environment changes, this tends to really shake things up, and species have to find a way to get by, and you get what we often refer to as adaptive radiation. And we just talked about how Washington State is pretty young and dynamic and has had a lot of change, and we see that in these different species of Lomatium. We have 20 some odd species of the genus Lomatium here that look similar in some ways, but all really quite different. And so changing environments encourage changing in species. So onto the mechanisms. How does this actually happen? There's a couple of major ideas out there. There are quite a few, and you could make a whole class just out of that one. But the first I'll talk about is genetic drift. And these are just chance events that cause a change in the genetic structure of a population. So the founder effect is one example of genetic drift, where let's imagine this. We have a mainland population of these flowers, right? So they have yellow and they have salmon-colored flowers. And a bird catches some of this seed on its feet as it lands in a little mud puddle to feed. It flies off into the ocean, finds an island and lands and drops the seed. But it just so happens, by pure chance, that the only color of flower carried by the genetics of that seed was the salmon-colored one. Well, there you go. Now that population is going to look different than the mainland population. So that's it, the genetic change over time. The new population looks different than the old population. It's going to have a different path than the old one does. The other one is a genetic bottleneck, and this kind of covers a lot of territory where you have an original population with a fair bit of variation, but then you have some sort of bottlenecking event. This could be a flood or a fire, somebody cutting down trees in a forest. And so most of these individuals do not survive. Only a few do. Maybe there's just one little valley that didn't get burned, for example. And so that's why they call it a bottleneck. Only a few escape this usually disastrous event. And so the surviving population looks different genetically than the original. You'll notice here it's mostly the blue genes, a little bit of white, and no yellow ones. So that would change the genetics of a population over time, mostly by narrowing the genetics. Well, Darwin and Wallace both traveled the world and noticed different species in different places. And I've talked about the theory of natural selection that they both came up with before. And this is a different idea altogether. So natural selection, that you have variation. So there was variation in play with genetic drift as well. And I think inheritance is implied there as well. But this one talks about the failure of individuals to reproduce or to survive, not based on chance, but on how good those inherited traits are. And the ones best suited to the environment are the ones that survive and reproduce and then pass on those variations. So natural selection is really trying to sort of fit a species to its environment. If we go back a couple, neither of these are really helping the species. Certain varieties dying out in many cases. But this one is saying, let's get rid of the bad stuff, the genes that don't help us survive, and keep the ones that do. And given enough time, Darwin really thought this could explain all the diversity of life on Earth. And so you can create these sort of family trees. This one's of dinosaurs. And I will note up here, we see birds, kind of in the same group as we see the more familiar T-Rex, that there was changes that happened over time. Some evidence that T-Rex and species similar to them were actually feathered. Not that they would fly, but that they had these little bumps on their outer covering, their skin, that may have been where feathers were, and that may have helped them insulate themselves, something that would be pretty valuable for a cold-blooded animal, especially if the weather changed quite a bit. And so Darwin thought, as did others, that over time these little changes selecting for new traits would be an advantage and cause species to change. And given enough time, then this could be more dramatic, something far more dramatic than antibiotic resistance or changing skin colors of people in different areas. None of those are changing species. And really this would take quite a long period of time. Sometimes people separate microevolution, those just changes in variation, with macroevolution, which is what you see pictured here, in terms of creating brand new species. When we look at plants on Earth, then we see this sort of idea. The ones on the left, the mosses, the simple ones, are the ones that seem to appear first in the fossil record, and then the ferns and fern-like plants, and then the gymnosperms, and then the angiosperms. So timeline would kind of suggest that we do have this progression of plants to get more and more complicated, especially in the ways that they reproduce. And that may be the result of natural selection and other forces. We have talked about some of the differences here that we can look at this family tree and this sort of branching point here, although we had some sort of algae type ancestor, that some of them developed this ability to produce spores and live on land and became mosses. The other ones down here, these algae, just continued being algae. So this isn't necessarily meant to be the same as a family tree for us, where each represents a different generation and the old ones die out. Here they may actually stay put. But then this whole branch going up this direction developed the ability to have vascular tissue. So all of the guys up here have vascular tissue, and we see that sort of outlined up in here, possess vascular tissue. So everything above that branching point, all three of these groups have vascular tissue, the ability to conduct water up tall stems. And then at this branching point, sort of diversifying from the ferns that make spores, we have gymnosperms and angiosperms that make seed. And so everything from there on can make seed. And then here, the ability to make flowers was something new, a different way of producing seed. So there's the phylogeny, in the way of saying a family tree, so to speak, of all the different plant species that have existed. And I might point out that along this family tree, this is a very, very simplified one. This represents well over 400,000 species of plants. You know, some of those have branched off and then ended as those species went extinct for a variety of reasons. I'd like to try to apply this to mammals as well. So we've taken on birds and we've taken on plants, and then mammals is the last major group that we've studied. And there's quite a few on here that really would not be all that familiar to us, especially these guys in here. Elephants have some relevance. Maybe at some point in this class I'll talk a little bit more about mammoths and some of the extinct creatures that we find in Washington State, but for the most part we can probably not worry about that group of it. A couple key ideas in this family tree. We see that most likely early mammals were very small and insect eaters, and those then changed over time. Some of them became the rodents that we're familiar with, and then some became carnivores, not as big of a change in some cases there. Bats, not surprisingly, kind of branched off on their own. They're not all that closely related to others. It looks like rabbits, the lagomorphs, and squirrels are pretty close to each other. That makes sense, consistent with what we've been saying. One of the weirder ones is what to do with the artiodactyls. These are the ungulates, and there's a good chance to talk about that. Artiodactyls are what your book calls them as well, and if you combine them with a lot of these other hoofed creatures, then we have the ungulate group. So it's a much broader group, even including elephants and horses and whatnot. But our deer and goats would be in the artiodactyl group, and they're actually kind of close to a lot of these other guys down here that are not as surprising, a lot of big plant-eating animals, as well as the cetaceans, the whales, which is a little strange. We see that on this next diagram, and this is the same diagram two times, and I think it's kind of nice to also demonstrate what I was talking about before, that science is run on theories and hypotheses, ideas that need to be tested, and these are two different ideas based on the current evidence. Nobody necessarily knows the answer. I mean, that's what kind of makes natural history exciting, is you can't just go back and hit rewind and come up with the right answer. And so people are trying to figure this out. And the one on the right, I find kind of interesting. I'll start with that. Some of these names here have to do with geology and continental drift, and Laurasia was kind of a mega continent. And the idea of you look at grouping these guys based on where they originated, then they fall out into these different groups, right? And so you'll see that how those are color coded. So we got the red group and the blue group, and they were all kind of from similar sort of areas. So here we see Afrotheria. So these are African types of animals, and that makes sense. Yeah, we got, you know, proboscids, the elephants, and the hyrax, which is a bizarre close relative. The manatee, I don't know if you've ever seen one of these guys, but they do kind of look like an underwater elephant. All right, so that's one way of looking at them. And if we take this a different approach here and look at more physiological features, then we see that things are a little more mixed up. Here on this branch, I'll start it over here. Then we see that that whole clade, that whole group, looks like it's a mix of yellow and red. So kind of a mix of this North America and Asia and Africa, which actually kind of makes some sense if you account for continental drift, and there's probably some mixing up of things. You know, a lot of the blues stay together, but they're mixed in with a little bit of red and yellow as well. So you get different pictures depending on what sort of traits you look at. In either case, it looks like monotremes and marsupials are really very different than the rest of placental mammals. So remember, all the mammals we've been looking at, except for the possum that I mentioned once, is they're all placental. So they don't have a pouch and they don't lay eggs like monotremes. So that's pretty consistent. The idea that insectivores really kind of are this base group, if we look at them and sort of trace them back, they branch off pretty early there. Other trends seem to be that rodents and lagomorphs, the rabbits and the rest of the rodents, are closely related. That makes sense. Bats are kind of out here on their own. Carnivores are kind of their own group. But here again we see cetaceans and hoofed animals, the whales and the deer, seem to be in the same group again. Really kind of odd. Do we find that over here on the right? Yeah, actually they even put them in the same group, kind of combining them into one, the artiodactyls and whales. So it seems like regardless of what they looked at, they seem to have some really similar features either way, suggesting that they come from a similar common ancestor, even though their life is very, very different. So there's a big overview of deep history, evolution on a really big and long scale, and it does shed some new light on the species that we have here in the state and how they got here.